January 15th, 1944, a pale winter sky and bomber crews praying they make it home. Then a glint, unpainted aluminum Mustangs arrive and refuse to leave. With Merlin power and drop tanks, they change the rules. Escort that becomes escort and hunt. German aces feel it first. Veterans running for home. Fuel low, hope lower. One plane, one design choice, and the air war is rewritten.
January 15, 1944. The winter sky above Aschersleben hung pale and still, a canvas of gray stretched tight across the Reich. At 27,000 feet, the temperature sat 30 degrees below zero. The contrails of 300 American bombers carved white scars through the frozen air, each vapor trail a thread in what the 8th Air Force called the bomber stream. Inside those steel fuselages, boys from Iowa and Georgia and Pennsylvania hunched over their guns, watching the horizon for the silhouettes they had learned to fear. The Focke-Wulf, the Messerschmitt. The names themselves had become prayers whispered against death. For months, the mathematics of day-like bombing had written themselves in blood. 10% losses per mission, 20%, sometimes more. The life expectancy of a bomber crew could be measured in sorties, counted on one hand. But on this January morning, something had changed. Something the German pilots had not yet learned to fear. High above the bombers, catching the pale sun on their unpainted aluminum skin, flew a fighter that would rewrite every assumption about air combat over Europe. The men who flew it called it the Cadillac of the sky. The Germans would soon call it something else entirely. The North American P-51 Mustang arrived in the European theater like an answer to a question the American air commanders had been asking since 1942. How do you protect a bomber formation all the way to Berlin and back? The answer, for 2 brutal years, had been, you don't. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt, powerful and rugged, could escort bombers deep into Germany, but lacked the range to go all the way. The Lockheed P-38 Lightning, twin-engined and distinctive, fought valiantly but struggled at high altitude in the frozen European sky. The bombers went on alone into the killing zone, and the Luftwaffe met them there with a tactical doctrine refined to surgical precision. The German fighter pilots, survivors of years of combat over Britain, Russia, and the Mediterranean, had learned to exploit the bombers' vulnerability with devastating efficiency. They attacked from 12 o'clock high, diving through formations with cannon fire that could tear a wing from a flying fortress in seconds. They coordinated their passes with the calm professionalism of experienced executioners, and they killed Americans by the thousands. But the Mustang changed the equation with a simplicity that bordered on elegance. It was not the most powerful fighter in the sky. It was not the fastest in a dive. It did not carry the heaviest armament. What it possessed was range. Extraordinary, unprecedented range. Fitted with drop tanks and an internal fuel capacity that seemed impossible for such a small airframe, the P-51 could fly from England to Berlin, engage in combat, and return home with fuel to spare. This single characteristic transformed the strategic bombing campaign from a war of attrition into something Germany could not win. Yet when the first Mustangs arrived at forward bases in England in late 1943, the Luftwaffe's response was not fear, it was dismissal. German intelligence reports described the aircraft as light gebaut, lightly built. German pilots, many of them veterans with dozens of kills, looked at the Mustang's sleek lines and thin wings and saw not a threat but a target. They had fought Spitfires and Thunderbolts. They had survived the best the Allies could send. This new American fighter, they believed, would be no different. They were catastrophically wrong. The misconception had roots in experience that seemed reasonable. German fighters, the Bf-109, the Fw-190, were built around different philosophies. They were compact, heavily armed, designed for short-range interception and brutal close-quarters combat. They could absorb punishment and keep flying. They turned tightly and climbed quickly. When German pilots first encountered the Mustang in combat over northwestern Germany in December 1943, they applied the tactics that had worked against every other Allied fighter. They tried to force it into a turning fight, where German engineering and pilot skill had always prevailed. What they discovered as the weeks turned to months and the Mustangs kept coming was that this American fighter refused to fight on German terms. It stayed high, it soared,
stayed fast. And most terrifyingly for the Jagdwaffe, the German fighter force, it stayed with the bombers all the way to the target and back. The psychological impact of this presence cannot be overstated. For German pilots who had grown accustomed to attacking bomber formations without fighter interference deep over the Reich, the sudden appearance of American fighters over Berlin, over Munich, over the synthetic oil plants of Silesia represented a fundamental shift in the mathematics of survival. Major Heinz Baer, an ace with over 200 victories, wrote in his combat diary after an engagement near Brunswick in February 1944 that the American escort fighters now possessed unnatural endurance. He described watching a formation of Mustangs circle at altitude for what seemed like hours, waiting for the Luftwaffe to commit. When German fighters finally attacked the bombers out of necessity, out of orders, the Mustangs dove on them with the advantage of height and speed. Baer noted that the American pilots were not yet as skilled individually as veteran German fighters, but their aircraft gave them the luxury of choosing when and where to fight. They could disengage at will, climbing away with power to spare, leaving the German fighters to burn fuel chasing ghosts. This tactical flexibility was more valuable than any measure of roll rate or turn radius. It meant the Mustang pilot controlled the geometry of combat, and in fighter-to-fighter warfare, control of geometry meant control of death. The technical specifications that made this possible were remarkably straightforward, yet their combination created something unprecedented. The Mustang's Packard-built Rolls-Royce Merlin V1650 engine produced 1,490 horsepower at altitude, where the thin air defeated lesser power plants. Its laminar flow wing design, revolutionary for its time, generated lift with minimal drag, allowing the aircraft to cruise at speeds that would drain fuel reserves in other fighters. Internal tanks held 269 gallons. With two 108-gallon drop tanks, total fuel capacity reached 485 gallons, nearly double that of a Bf-109G. This translated to an operational radius of 750 miles with reserves for combat. From airfields in East Anglia, that radius drew a circle that encompassed every target the 8th Air Force wanted to bomb: Berlin, Leipzig, Schweinfurt, Regensburg, Ploesti. For the first time in the air war over Europe, the bomber crews could see their escorts not just over the Channel, not just over the Rhine, but over the target itself. The psychological effect on American morale was immediate. The effect on German morale would prove irreversible. Spring 1944 brought the air war to its crescendo. Operation Argument, Big Week, saw the 8th Air Force launch maximum effort raids against German aircraft manufacturing plants across the Reich. The goal was not subtle: destroy the Luftwaffe on the ground and in the air, eliminate its ability to regenerate, and clear the skies for the invasion everyone knew was coming. Between February 20 and February 25, American bombers struck Regensburg, Augsburg, Stuttgart, Schweinfurt, and a dozen other targets. The Luftwaffe rose to meet them with everything it had, every available fighter, every pilot who could still fly. The battles that week were among the most intense of the entire war. But now the math had changed. The Mustangs went all the way. Luftwaffe pilots found themselves fighting not over France or Belgium, where they could break off and land at nearby bases, but deep over Germany, where every minute of combat burned fuel they needed to reach home. American pilots, flying fighters that sipped fuel like a gentleman's sports car, could afford to wait. They could afford to chase, and chase they did. On February 22, 1944, a formation of P-51s from the 357th Fighter Group encountered a group of Bf-109s climbing to intercept bombers near Halberstadt.
The engagement began at 25,000 feet, standard altitude for bomber escort. The German pilots, following doctrine, tried to zoom climb past the Mustangs to reach the bombers above. But the Merlin engines in those American fighters had power to spare at altitude. The Mustangs climbed with them, then through them, gaining position. When the Germans turned to engage, the Americans refused the turning fight. They dove away, extended, then
climbed back with speed advantage. This cycle repeated until the German formation began to fragment. Individual 109s, fuel running low, broke off and headed for home. The Mustangs followed, not to the border, not to the Rhine, all the way to the airfield. Several German pilots, attempting to land with American fighters on their tails, crashed on approach. Those who made it down taxied to dispersals and shut down engines that had been running at combat power for too long. The mechanics who serviced those aircraft found fuel tanks nearly empty. One more engagement, they calculated, and the pilots would not have made it back. This scenario repeated itself dozens of times during Big Week. German pilots began to speak of the American fighters with something approaching dread. The reports used different words: ubiquitous, relentless, everywhere. The Luftwaffe's response evolved through desperation. They tried massing fighters for overwhelming attacks, but the Mustangs broke up their formations before they could coordinate. They tried standing patrols over the bomber routes, but the Mustangs simply stayed higher and waited. They tried attacking from the sun, from cloud cover, from every angle veteran pilots knew, and the Americans learned, adapted, and came back the next day with better tactics. By March 1944, German fighter pilots were being shot down over their own airfields within sight of their ground crews. The psychological impact of this cannot be measured in statistics, but it appears clearly in the tone of Luftwaffe combat reports from the period. Where earlier reports described engagements with technical precision, altitudes, vectors, weapons effectiveness, the spring 1944 reports increasingly mention fatigue, losses of experienced pilots, and problems with morale. The word Mustang appears with frequency. Sometimes it is the only fighter type specifically mentioned, as if Thunderbolts and Lightnings had ceased to matter. The Mustang had become synonymous with American air superiority. And air superiority, the Germans were learning, meant more than just control of the sky. It meant control of the future. Lieutenant Franz Stigler, a German ace who survived the war with 28 victories, later described the Mustang
as the fighter that made us realize we had already lost. His memoir, published decades after the war, contains a passage about an engagement over Bavaria in April 1944. His Staffel, squadron, had intercepted a formation of B-17s heading for Munich. They were preparing their attack run when the call came over the radio. Indiana, hoch, Indians, high, the Luftwaffe slang for enemy fighters. Stigler looked up and saw, impossibly far away, a trail of contrails diving toward them, Mustangs. His squadron leader ordered them to press the attack. The bombers were the mission, the reason they flew. But Stigler watched half his squadron break off and dive away before they even began their run. They had calculated the odds and decided to live. Those who stayed, including Stigler, made one pass on the bombers and then ran for their lives, pursued by American fighters that seemed to have unlimited fuel and ammunition. Stigler made it home with cannon damage to his tail and a bullet hole through his canopy. 2 of his wingmen did not return. In his memoir, Stigler wrote that after that day, he understood the war was over. It simply had not stopped yet. The Americans could go anywhere they wanted. The Germans could only decide where to die. By summer 1944, the statistical reality confirmed what the German pilots felt in their bones. The 8th Air Force's loss rates for escorted missions had dropped from the catastrophic 20% of 1943 to less than 3%. Meanwhile, Luftwaffe losses climbed steadily. In June 1944 alone, the Jagdwaffe lost over 500 pilots, killed, wounded, or missing. The training pipeline could not replace them with anything approaching the same quality. New pilots arrived at combat units with 50 hours in type, barely enough to take off and land safely, and were thrown into combat against Americans who might have 200 hours in the Mustang and a dozen kills. The life expectancy of these replacement pilots could be measured in days. Some died on their first mission. The veterans who remained, the Experten with their Knight's Crosses and their scores of victories, found themselves forced to fly mission after mission without adequate rest, without proper maintenance for their aircraft, without hope of victory. They flew because they were ordered to fly, because their bases were being bombed, because their cities were burning. But they no longer flew with the confidence that had characterized the Jagdwaffe in its glory years. They flew with the grim knowledge that the Americans owned the sky. The aluminum skin of the Mustang became a symbol that transcended its tactical role. It was unpainted, natural metal finish, bare and gleaming, because paint added weight, and the aircraft's designers had calculated that every pound mattered for range. But that naked aluminum caught the light in a way that made the aircraft visible for miles. German civilians, watching from the ground as American formations passed overhead, began to associate that particular gleam with their own helplessness. The aluminum fighter, untouched by camouflage because it needed no camouflage, because it operated with such confidence that concealment was unnecessary. Soviet pilots, seeing Lend-Lease Mustangs operating on the Eastern Front, called them silverbirds. The Japanese, encountering them over the Pacific, used similar terminology. But in Germany, the aluminum Mustang meant something more specific. It meant the Americans could go anywhere they chose. It meant the Reich's borders were fiction. It meant the war was coming home. The summer of 1944 brought the Mustang to Berlin in force. On March 6th, the first large-scale raid on the German capital with full fighter escort penetrated the city's airspace in daylight for the first time. The Luftwaffe scrambled everything available, over 300 fighters. The resulting battle sprawled across 50 miles of sky. When it was over, American bombers had hit their targets and returned home with losses under 5%. 69 German fighters did not return. Among them were 11 Experten, aces with more than 20 victories each. The irreplaceable veterans were dying, and with them died institutional knowledge that could not be taught in the war.
Abbreviated training programs the Luftwaffe now employed. By June 1944, German fighter pilots averaged less than half the flight hours of their American counterparts. The Americans, meanwhile, were cycling experienced pilots back to training units to teach the next generation. The systemic advantage this created compounded over time. The Luftwaffe was not just losing aircraft, it was losing the ability to train pilots who could survive long enough to become competent. Oberleutnant Heinz Knoke, a veteran pilot with 33 victories, wrote in his published diary about the profound psychological shift that occurred in the Jagdwaffe during this period. He described watching a formation of Mustangs escort bombers over his base near Hanover, circling lazily at altitude while the bombers unloaded on the runways below. German fighters were available, dozens of them, parked in revetments around the field. But they could not take off because the runway was being bombed. And the Mustangs simply waited. When the raid was over and German crews rushed to fill craters so fighters could scramble, the Mustangs were still there, circling. Knoke wrote that he felt in that moment the full weight of German defeat. The enemy could destroy your base while you watched, then prevent you from responding, then leave when they were ready, all without you having any say in the matter. This was not combat. This was execution in slow motion. The aluminum glint of those American fighters, visible even from the ground, became for Knoke the symbol of American industrial might. They built them so well they did not even need to paint them. They had so many they could afford to let them circle uselessly for hours, burning fuel that Germany could no longer spare, just to make a point. The operational statistics from the final year of the war in Europe tell the story in numbers that acquire a certain horror when contemplated. Between D-Day and VE Day, the 8th and 9th Air Forces claimed over 5,000 enemy aircraft destroyed in the air.
The Mustang units alone accounted for nearly half that total. German aircraft production, despite heroic efforts to disperse factories and increase output, could not keep pace with losses. By early 1945, the Luftwaffe possessed thousands of aircraft on paper, but could not fly them for lack of fuel, lack of pilots, or lack of both. Mustang formations encountered German fighters on the ground more often than in the air, lined up on airfields, hidden under trees, camouflaged in barns. The Americans destroyed them there, methodically, field by field. The great fighter force that had conquered Poland and France, that had nearly broken Britain, that had killed so many Soviet pilots the Eastern Front became a slaughterhouse, that force died not in one grand battle, but in 1,000 small defeats, chased across its own homeland by a fighter its pilots had initially dismissed as too light, too weak, too American to matter. The concept of too light deserves examination because it reveals the fundamental difference in design philosophy that separated American and German engineering by 1944. German fighters were built to maximize performance in specific regimes: climb rate, turn rate, firepower. Every design decision prioritized combat effectiveness over range because German fighters operated over Germany, where range was not a critical factor. The Bf-109, backbone of the Jagdwaffe, could outclimb a Mustang in the first minutes of flight. The FW-190 could outturn it in certain conditions. But these advantages became meaningless when German pilots had to conserve fuel for the flight home, while their opponents could stay and fight for as long as the engagement lasted. The Mustang's designers had made different choices, accepting slightly lower performance in some areas to achieve overwhelming superiority in the one metric that mattered most: time over target. This was not a compromise born of technical limitation, it was strategic sophistication. The Americans understood that air superiority was not won in individual dogfights, but in the cumulative effect of presence, the ability to be everywhere, always, until the enemy stopped trying to fight back. That presence extended beyond combat. Mustang pilots, with fuel to spare on the return leg from deep penetration missions, were authorized to strafe targets of opportunity: railroad trains, truck convoys, airfields, anything that moved. The Luftwaffe could no longer move aircraft safely by day. They could not transport fuel. They could not reinforce threatened sectors. The paralysis this created affected every aspect of German military operations. When Allied armies broke out of Normandy in August 1944, the Wehrmacht's response was hampered by an inability to move reserves without being attacked from the air. When the Ardennes offensive was launched in December, Germany's final desperate gamble, it depended entirely on bad weather grounding Allied air power. When the weather cleared, Mustangs and Thunderbolts turned the German columns into wreckage. The aluminum fighter that German pilots had underestimated had become an instrument of total air dominance. It did not matter that individual German pilots might still be skilled, the German aircraft might still be technically impressive in certain ways. The Americans controlled the sky, and they controlled it with such completeness that German forces on the ground planned their operations around the assumption that American fighters would be overhead. Lieutenant Urban Drew of the 361st Fighter Group became, on October 7, 1944, the only Allied pilot to shoot down 2 Messerschmitt Me-262 jets in a single engagement. The Me-262 was everything German propaganda claimed: faster than any Allied fighter, heavily armed, technologically revolutionary. In a fair fight, it would have dominated. But Drew understood that the jet's vulnerabilities were temporal, not technical. It was fast but fragile. It burned fuel prodigiously, and it had to land eventually. Drew positioned his Mustang near the jet base at Achmar and waited. When 2 262s came into land, gear down and slow, he dove on them and killed both before they touched runway. This became standard Mustang tactics against the jets: deny them sanctuary, attack them when they were vulnerable, never give them the chance to use their speed advantage. The Me-262 program, which should have been a terror weapon, was neutralized not by better Allied technology, but by operational patience and tactical flexibility. The Mustang could not outrun a jet, but it could outweight one, and outweight was all that mattered. By early 1945, the question was no longer whether Germany would lose the air war, but how long the dying would take. Mustang formations roamed over Germany at will, sometimes encountering no opposition for entire missions. When they did meet German fighters, the engagements were increasingly one-sided. Veteran American pilots with 50, 60, 70 combat missions faced German teenagers with almost no training. The results were predictable. On April 7, 1945, in one of the last major air battles over Germany, Mustangs from several groups encountered a formation of over 100 German fighters, attempting to intercept bombers near Hamburg. In the resulting dogfight, the Americans claimed 51 destroyed for the loss of 3. The German formation was annihilated. Many of the German pilots killed that day were younger than the aircraft they flew. They died over their own country, shot down by an enemy they had been told was inferior, flying an aircraft they had been told was weak. The propaganda had been catastrophically wrong. The Mustang was not too light. It was exactly heavy enough to carry the weight of American industrial supremacy into the heart of the Reich and stay there until nothing remained to fight. The final accounting is written in production numbers that still stagger comprehension. North American Aviation produced over 15,000 P-51 Mustangs in less than 4 years. They built them in Inglewood, California and Dallas, Texas, thousands of miles from any front line, safe from bombing, supplied by an industrial base that was simultaneously producing bombers and tanks and ships and everything else an army needed. German factories, dispersed and hidden, working with slave labor and constant material shortages under constant bombardment, managed to produce over 30,000 Bf-109s throughout the entire war. But those aircraft were built to replace losses the Luftwaffe could not afford. American Mustangs were built to establish and maintain a superiority that became absolute. The mathematics of attrition favored the side that could lose aircraft and replace them
Overnight, that could train pilots without fear of their training bases being attacked, that could stockpile fuel and ammunition without worrying about supply lines being interdicted. Germany had none of these luxuries by 1944. Every Mustang over Berlin was a reminder that America could build faster than Germany could destroy. The war ended on May 8, 1945, with the Luftwaffe long since defeated. In the final weeks, Mustang pilots flew missions more to break the monotony than from military necessity. They strafed empty airfields, they bombed abandoned vehicles, they escorted bombers that sometimes found no targets worth hitting. The aluminum fighters that had once fought their way to Berlin against savage opposition now flew through empty sky, chasing memories. When the shooting stopped, the surviving German pilots returned to a country destroyed, their bases rubble, their aircraft scrap. The Americans flew home to bases in England, then shipped home to the United States aboard the same ships that had brought them to war. Many of the Mustangs never returned. They were sold, scrapped, or left to rust in fields across Europe. They had served their purpose. They had broken the Luftwaffe. They had cleared the sky for the invasion. They had proven that American engineering, when given the right objective, could produce not just adequate solutions, but dominant ones. In the decades after the war, survivors from both sides met occasionally at reunions and symposia. German pilots who had faced the Mustang spoke of it with respect that bordered on awe. They acknowledged that it had been the superior aircraft for the mission it was designed to accomplish. Not dogfighting, not interception, but escort. Long-range escort, deep into enemy territory, maintaining presence until the enemy stopped coming up to fight. This was the mission that won the air war. American pilots, for their part, generally respected the skill of the German pilots they had fought, even as they recognized that skill alone could not overcome systematic disadvantage. The Luftwaffe had been defeated not because its pilots lacked courage or ability, but because they fought for a regime that could not match the industrial and logistical power of the alliance arrayed against it. The Mustang was not invincible. It was simply good enough, produced in sufficient numbers, and employed with strategic wisdom. That combination proved unstoppable. The aluminum gleam of a P-51 Mustang catching the sun at 25,000 feet became, in the winter and spring of 1945, the last thing many German pilots saw. Not because the Mustang was the fastest or the most heavily armed, but because it was there, always there, over the target, over the base, over the transport routes, over Germany itself. A silver reminder that the nation which had started the war by attacking its neighbors now could not defend its own skies. The symbolic weight of this reversal, the Luftwaffe that had bombed Warsaw and Rotterdam and London, unable to prevent American bombers from flying in formation over Berlin in broad daylight, represented the complete collapse of German military power in a way that ground combat, mobile and chaotic, could not match. The sky was empty of defenders. The aluminum fighters owned it. And that ownership, more than any single battle, more than any technological miracle, decided the outcome of the air war. In the end, the German pilots were right about one thing. The Mustang was light. It was lighter than a Thunderbolt, lighter than a Lightning, light enough to fly farther on the same fuel, light enough to climb faster at altitude, light enough to turn tightly when necessary. But that lightness was not weakness. It was efficiency. It was the product of designers who understood that in total war, the aircraft that could stay in the fight longest would win, regardless of how the fight began. The Germans built fighters to win dogfights. The Americans built a fighter to win the air war. The distinction proved decisive. And when the last German fighter landed for the final time, and the pilot climbed out and looked up at the empty sky, perhaps he understood what his commanders had failed to grasp until too late, that the aluminum fighter
They had dismissed, that their pilots had called too light to matter, had been exactly heavy enough to carry the weight of their defeat.